Hello, hello. I'm Don Ridenour. Welcome to what's probably going to be the last episode of Talk to a Therapist. It's been going on for 6 weeks now, minus last week when I was unable to live stream as I had intended. So welcome tonight. I hope I get some good questions and comments, any questions really, and some comments, and so we can have some discussion tonight. And we'll see where it goes. Oops, I forgot to turn on another light here. There we go. So welcome to my studio. So I will be taking your questions. We will be having some discussion. If you're not part of the live stream, but you're looking at it later, welcome. Glad you took the time to take a listen and a look at my live stream. And so we are all good to go. And in just a second, we'll get into kind of some reviews of things we've talked about in the earlier sessions, and maybe some new ideas, new suggestions. And I hope you'll be part of it with your comments. Please don't divulge anything too personal, since this is not a confidential line and this is not actually therapy, but whatever you're comfortable with. And we'll just have a good discussion here. So I'm glad you're here. Welcome. So it seems like an age ago, in the first session, I talked a lot about grief and the fact that grief is an ongoing process. And if you've seen my Facebook page at all, you'll know that I share some things about grief from time to time. And I'm going to get up here one of my all-time favorite posts by a Scottish author. And let's see if I get it here real quick. Yep. So I'll share my screen here in just a second. Well, I wish I could get this all on the screen at one time, though. I wonder if I can do this. Oh, yeah, it's expanded. That's why it's so. That's going to be too small to read if I do that. So that's too small. So I'll just show it all to you. But let me go to StreamYard, and I'm going to do forgive me, I'm still learning StreamYard. Here we go. Whoa, that didn't come out the way I thought it would. Oh, I know why. Hang on just a second. Okay, there. So this is a poem by Donna Ashworth, and it's entitled, "You Don't Just Lose Someone Once." And it goes like this. You lose them over and over, sometimes many times a day. When the loss, momentarily forgotten, creeps up and attacks you from behind. Fresh waves of grief as the realization hits home, they are gone again. You don't just lose someone once. You lose them every time you open your eyes to a new dawn. As you awaken, so does your memory. So does the jolting bolt of lightning that rips into your heart. They are gone again. Losing someone is a journey, not a one-off. There is no end to the loss. There is only a learned skill on how to stay afloat when it washes over. Be kind to those who are sailing this stormy sea. They have a journey ahead of them and a daily shock to the system each time they realize they are gone again. You don't just lose someone once. You lose them every day for a lifetime. And this is by the author Donna Ashworth. And there is a link at the bottom of that you can find on my Facebook page to go to her website. And I highly recommend it. She's written a lot about grief. But here is the image that accompanied it. And it is really striking. And it really conveys the loss of someone we love. So I thought you would find that interesting and touching. And it's been what I've been teaching my clients, or it expresses what I teach my clients, that grief isn't over. Grief is a journey. And so that's the first thing we talked about in that session. In another session, we talked about depression and the intensity of depression, the situational depression versus genetic predispositional biochemical depression. Jury's still out on all that. They're learning more and more every day, but there are differences. And that's a timely topic because today I had a case, a person who came in and talked about what they described as a depressive episode. And the more we talked about it, the more it became 90% clear to me that it was a purely situational depression. It was not going to be a depressive disorder recurring. Now, the reason I say 90% sure is because there's always a question if you've got all of the information you need. And there's a question about, was it the first time in the beginning of a recurring biochemical ongoing illness process? And so there's no way to know that until time passes. Given the history, though, of normalcy, of a lack of mental health issues, a lack of precipitating factors, it's unlikely to be that. Instead, it was simply getting stuck in life and reacting by withdrawing and losing interest and being internally focused. One of the reasons I was able to come to that conclusion is because none of the typical, what we call vegetative symptoms were present. There was no weight loss. There was no excessive sleeping. There was no loss in libido. There was no loss in any of the biologically oriented symptoms. There was an increase in withdrawal, a loss of motivation. Oh, and there was no suicidal ideology. And there was no heavy guilt other than what was associated directly with the situational factors. So, and the person has already mostly recovered and moved on and so it was really being stuck on a path that was not really their own, and coming to that decision, having to deal with it internally first, and then making changes in their life that were risky to their long-term relationships, and setting on a new path and being in transition to that new path. So all of that weighs on the side of it being a situational problem and not an ongoing recurrent depression. So there are differences, and it's important that they be correctly diagnosed. So we'll follow up. I'll gather more information, but I really would be very surprised if it turned out to be anything more than a crisis in living. And so that would be the kind of diagnosis we would typically call an adjustment reaction with depressed mood. So that's an example of what I was talking about then. And another time, I think in that second session, I talked about when a depression came out of nowhere. There were no situational factors, and that turned out to be the beginning of a recurrent major depression. So a lot goes into that diagnosis if it's done correctly. So that was the content, and I think it was probably the second session. Another session, I talked about what is the most destructive factor to mental health. And I said, without a doubt, it's childhood maltreatment, sexual, physical, emotional abuse of a severe level that results in that being carried on often for generations, one generation to the next. Occasionally someone breaks out of that cycle, but it causes massive damage. And if you're interested in following up on that, look for some of the research on the ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Events Scale. Adverse Childhood Events Scale, or commonly called ACES, ACEs. You'll find a ton of stuff about what the outcomes are for people with moderate to high scores on that scale. And it's really very staggering when you look at it. So I talked about that a lot. Talked about the differences in prolonged grief versus normal grieving. I've talked about trauma. And I'm going to go on my soapbox here for a minute about trauma. Everybody wants to be traumatized these days. And it's, I think, pushed by social media in the sense that not everything, blamed everything on social media right now, but this happens actually a lot, and it happened before social media. A language will develop around something that's severe, and then it gradually gets associated with less and less severe things. And the same thing is happening to trauma and traumatized. So trauma is, in the mental health sense, is exposure to a life-threatening situation and of either self or loved ones, either witnessing it or having someone else witness it and being part of their life closely around that time. Very trauma. That is trauma. And that is being traumatized. And what follows from that, that would qualify as post-traumatic stress syndrome, would be nightmares, flashbacks. And by a flashback, I don't just mean remembering it, but suddenly feeling as if you're back in the situation again. That's a true flashback. Reliving the incident. So you've got nightmares, flashbacks, you've got intrusive thoughts. We're right in the middle of a conversation with someone else. You just suddenly have some words, thoughts, ideas about that traumatic situation again. Dissociation, where you don't feel like you're in your own body. And then, oh shoot, I was just thinking of it. Avoidance behavior, avoiding situations, people that remind one of it. That's the core of PTSD. So what I'm starting to object to is I'm hearing people say, oh, I was chewed out by my boss and it was traumatizing, or I was traumatized by what they said. That's not trauma, and you're not traumatized. That's dramatic. That's being dramatic for the sake of making a point and way overstating it. And that does not help when you take a word like that and begin to use it in more everyday situations. It loses its weight to describe, excuse me, to describe the serious, real situations. Now, some people use it because they're trying to understand what it must have meant to someone, but they have no way to really relate to what real trauma is. And so they imagine it in their minds and they think of it, and they invariably come up with things less traumatic because they've never experienced trauma and they can't think of it. And so they apply the word to other situations that aren't really traumatic. So it happens for a couple of reasons, but it gets overused. So please do me a favor, stop using the word trauma unless you're really talking about actual trauma. Now, there are other kinds of trauma. There's physical trauma that medical people would say there was trauma to the chest or trauma to the legs, whatever. But that's a different sort of trauma. And I'm referring only to the mental health side. And that's the way it's used in the everyday conversations where it's overblown. So now I get off my soapbox. Let's see. Oh, I talked about what it's like to be a therapist and what it's like to be sitting in a chair in an office where people come in and expect some help from you, and that for very serious situations, and how that feels, and the challenges and obligations and responsibilities that brings with it, and the when it's frustrating, when it's fulfilling. So all of that. So that's really a fun thing for me to talk about. Although my favorite thing to talk about really is the incredible brains we have and what we can do with them. And my gateway to understanding that is through all of my training over many, many years in hypnosis, and seeing how people react and what they can and can't control really. And just today, I had a tremendously exciting session where I had a woman with a long history of dissociative identity disorder. And usually we think of that as an incurable personality kind of issue. But I don't think that's really accurate. What I think goes on And this was the history that she had behind this, is there is severe trauma, usually in early childhood, sometimes later. And it's so severe that the person cannot cope with it in any normal way. They can't understand it. They can't stand the pain. They can't stand the just the feelings of it all. They can't understand why it's happening. They can't understand. They just can't cope with it. And in order to spare I guess you could call it the ego, or the executive person, the brain compartmentalizes into separate personalities. And those personalities experience for the executive person. Let me back up a second. Let me explain my terminology. And I've developed some of this. So I'm not sure you'll see this if you read any of this stuff anywhere else. But our inner experience is highly complicated. We all have different parts of us. And in the hypnotic work I do, I work with different parts of the mind. And that is not dissociative identity disorder. That is simply the way we are. And honestly, we make those up sometimes in hypnosis. We don't know that there was a part that well, for instance, the creative part. I'll say, I want to talk to the creative part. And the creative part, you can come up with all kinds of interesting ideas and new ways to handle these kind of problems. And so I'd like you to work on that task while we talk to the rest of the parts. And then the protective part, we know you're just trying to keep this person safe. Of course, that's what all the parts do. But we all are a little different in different situations. If we sit down with our kids to play, we are far more childlike. If we color, if we play ball, if we do that, we're more childlike when we do that. And we can talk like children, and we can be a child again in a certain sense. If we need to be tough and strong in another situation and stare somebody down, we can do that. Many of us can. So we all have this ability to be pretty flexible in really who we are and what we present to the world out of all of that. So all of that already exists. So in my thinking about this, the way I understand this, these parts really are called upon to become the current executive in a sense, so that the person, the core person, does not have to experience the pain, the humiliation, the full trauma of what's happening. And so in this particular case, there was a personality who saw everything that happened, saw now, not experienced. And that personality can't talk. And so that's a way of protecting the whole person from having to hear the thoughts of what happened. The images may still be there because the personality saw it, but they can't speak about it. They are mute. And that part absorbs the full reality of what happened. The other parts were just escapist. I'll be this little girl, happy little girl doing this. And that's what I do in my mind while I'm being raped or beaten or both or drowned or whatever it was. And so, and those can be very well developed. My understanding is there are documented cases of even having different physical maladies that are backed up Today I saw a personality complain that didn't understand why the executive person was wearing glasses and took them off. Consistent, age-appropriate speech, characteristics. And so, and by the way, there are many people who are skeptical that this is even a thing, that it's all contrived and manipulative. And there are a lot of cases of that. And so, and that's probably more common than real cases. This is a pretty extreme, in fact, it's a very extreme reaction to very extreme situations. And so, so where it went today was I'd already worked with this person to gain some control over switching personalities. I worked with the executive to be able to come back to the forefront and be the dominant personality. Whereas that had never been possible for her ever in her since she started actually experiencing the switching to other personalities. And it gave her a terrible headache, but she was able to do it. And since then, she's gotten better at it. She's even coached other people how to help her do it. And so that's become better for her. Ultimately, she was embarrassed in a social situation when she switched personalities to a little girl in a completely inappropriate place. And after she returned to her executive personality, she was totally embarrassed, felt worthless, like she would never be okay, and all of that. And so isn't that phenomenal that the brain is capable of all of this? And so today I was able to work with her and with all those parts. And I was talking to the executive part, and I was complimenting all of the parts for helping her survive and be who she is today, and to have survived all that horrible stuff, and that they had done their roles very well. But now, in doing what they've always done, they're actually hurting her. They're embarrassing her socially. They're making her question her own competency and her own worth to even be alive. And none of them want to hurt her. They're there to protect her. And so in the middle of that, she switched. And a personality I hadn't talked to before, but I'd heard about, talked. And then another one. And we made an agreement that they would stay in the background and allow her to handle her own problems as an adult, and that they would never have to go away because they're always part of her. But they had some things they wanted. They wanted her, one of them wanted her to continue coloring in child coloring books with lots of crayons. The other one wanted her to appear more of a certain way with makeup and clothes. And so those were reasonable requests, I thought, and they were never going to go away. And so all those parts could be part of her, but they weren't going to ever step out and take control again. And so I asked her to switch back. She did within a minute or so. And it's interesting to watch the transition, because in the middle of it, the person becomes nobody, which is really odd. You see an absolutely blank expression on the face, and then there's a gradual transition and the facial features change and they become the next person. And so she the executive function returned. Talked to her about the agreement, which she certainly agreed to. She said she already felt better, and that I reminded her that this also meant she could not escape from pain anymore, because she has pain from a different source. And she could not escape from bad feelings or bad situations, that she had to deal with them as an adult. And she can use all the parts of her personality to inform her decisions, but she is the executive and can't hide in those personalities. And that brought kind of a chuckle out. And so, and yes, you can say that's evidence for it being just manipulative, but that's not, and it is. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real. That's just a way of using it later to some benefit. And we all do that in certain ways, and being called out on the ways that we are avoiding our issues is part of therapy and part of life. So it's just that. It's not, that doesn't discount any of the rest of it, in my opinion. So she agreed to that. She then began to describe a project she'd been involved with that was really pleasing to her. It had to do with her home. And she became very childlike in her enthusiasm and her description about how great it was. And I continued to address her as the executive name to reinforce that she was not switching, that she had not switched, even though she was childlike. And so it was, and she didn't switch. And I talked to her about the freedom to be expressive in many different ways, and that none of those parts were ever going to go away. They were just going to be in the background, and that she was free to express herself in fullness. And it's important, I believe, that people have that freedom. And I used some imagery from one of her hobbies that's beautiful and involves nature, and to feel free in that environment, and she could follow all of that, and did some mental imagery around all of that to tie all of this together. And so I'm expecting that she probably will hardly ever switch again. Now, the one thing that could change that would be some kind of severe trauma, because in severe trauma, we fall back to our basic habits. And so that could undo it. But other than that, it probably won't. And I think that'll be interesting. And it's going to be fun to watch her next year or two of life and see if she stops switching at all, which I think she will. That's my bet. So it'll be fun to find out. And I certainly hope so for her sake. That's the important thing. So anyway, that's one of the reasons I like being a therapist, because I get to do work like that. And I truly enjoy that. Many people of the serious hypnotherapists who have psychological training, and typically who follow the psychiatrist. I'm blanking on names tonight. Sorry. I'll come up with it in just a second. Sorry. And I'm not going to stop the broadcast or anything like that. That's just me. I struggle with names a lot of times. And so hypnosis itself, as you probably know, is been argued over the last century and a half about whether it's even real or not. And then what you mean by real and what you don't mean. And so all of us go in and out of a trance state multiple times a day. It's a normal, natural thing. We call it daydreaming, but it's an altered state of consciousness. It's just that some people can use it better than others. Aldous Huxley, for instance, it's well documented that when he was working on a particular idea or problem, he would continue to function. For instance, answering the door and receiving a package, but have no memory of it because he was so internally focused on what he was working on. So it's that kind of a process we get. Been driving for a couple hours, and we realize we don't remember the last 40 minutes. And yet we fully and normally functioned as a driver. And so it's that kind of thing. So everybody does that. The brain does it automatically multiple times a day. So a hypnotist is someone who has learned the skills of helping other people enter that trance state. A hypnotherapist is somebody who can use it for the client's benefit and knows how to make that trance state productive. And it is really incredible. Milton Erickson, that's the psychiatrist. He demonstrated a wide range of way beyond what people had accomplished through trance work prior to him. And it was just phenomenal. A real pioneer. So I overheard a psychiatrist I worked with say once that, oh yeah, hypnosis is something, it can be good for habit control. It can be good for relaxation. It can be good for those kind of things. And while that is true, that's an incredibly limited way of looking at what can actually be accomplished. I have had people come in using a walker for fear of falling because every so often they suddenly go limp. And I've had them leave the session with me carrying the walker and them walking fully. And then the next session going for a fast-paced walk around the block with them setting the pace, and I could hardly keep up. So it's pretty amazing, really, what can be accomplished with the right kind of work and through that very deep trance work. But I have seen it just help people accomplish amazing things in very short periods of time. And so that's what I love to do. That's the most enjoyable part of being a therapist for me. And I realize today that one thing I do miss is having like-minded therapists around to talk about that kind of work. I do enjoy that. So if you are one of those people, by any chance you happen to see this, get a hold of me. Let's just shoot the breeze and talk about war stories so that we can have fun like that. I miss being able to do that. So those are the things we've talked about over these 5 previous episodes. I hope they've been helpful. I've gotten a couple of comments saying that it was useful information, helpful information. I don't think it's terribly entertaining, and I've actually come to the conclusion that people really don't like to talk that much about mental health, really. And maybe I'd do better doing a comedy channel. Or how to fix drywall, or how to repair my car, or things like that. But I think if I do anything in the future in this medium, it'll be really on hypnotherapy, because that's what's so intriguing to me. So if you have comments about that, I would appreciate hearing them. We've been live about 40 minutes now. So I think I'm going to stop here in a couple more minutes, unless I get some comments or questions. that I can talk about. And I think this will be very, let's see, I have some kind of a comment. Nope, wasn't about that. So hope this will be valuable. If not right now as I'm live streaming it, sometime later when somebody finds it and reviews it. And I appreciate all of you. I hope you have a great evening and a wonderful life. And this is Don Ridenour. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. And feel free to reach out to me on my Facebook page and or through these comments, and we can chat about something. So thanks again. Good night.